All right, recording. New anarcho-primitivist producer Leo is lurking in the corner. Hi, Leo.
I don't even know what you guys are doing.
We're recording a Patreon podcast.
I didn't know you guys were. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude.
Oh, no, that's okay.
It's like shutting that door super slow. I didn't want to make another sound by leaving if you were.
Yeah, go, you can leave now. We'll be out in like 10 minutes. Or you can stick around if you want to just sit here.
Nah, I don't want to make a noise.
Okay.
Please leave every bit of that at the front of the Patreon podcast.
This is hell.
This is hell, and on this week's Patreon podcast, exclusively for our Patreon subscribers, that's you, we're sharing one of my very favorite interviews of all time, our nearly hour-long January 27th, 2001 interview with Penny Rimbaud, member of the seminal 1970s anarchist punk band, the very first punk band, Crass. Conversation you're about to hear had a huge impact on my worldview, and therefore had a huge impact here on This Is Hell. Penny explains the limitations of labels, which is why I never accept any labels on my politics, my philosophy, or this radio show. And you can kind of hear that on the air. Penny describes how the only way the media will talk to you is if you are talking about whatever the media is talking about, within the limits the media puts upon any and all dissenting voices, which is why I hope on This Is Hell to avoid the media narrative and do what we can to destroy it. Penny told us that your inspiration isn't as important as the content of your message, which is why I avoid answering questions or even thinking about the idea of what is the inspiration for this show, because all of history, that is, as I understand history, leading up to this moment, is our inspiration, I guess. Penny tells us about Crass's graffiti campaign and how they saw public advertising as their canvas to fuck with, as we do that with our This Is Hell advertising stickers. Penny wants us to not be in the way of ourselves and let our morality grow, which I hope to have done over my 22 years here on This Is Hell, and I hope to continue to do as long as I live, instead of being the kind of egotist talk show host who knows they are correct and uses that misplaced righteousness in defending their opinion. Instead, I'd like to learn. Penny taught me to initially give my trust and love to others, that nobody has to earn respect. They should all already have it. The story all starts the 1960s Dollhouse Commune, of course, in southeast England, a movement that was about getting away from how bad things were getting, going back to the land and creating a new way of life that included, among other things, subsistence farming, which sounds familiar to some people's ideas today. Penny describes their unauthorized squatting and free festivals at Stonehenge, which leads to the ultimate demise of one of his cohorts under suspicious circumstances while being held by the state. The death of that colleague politicizes the movement, and Crass was born out of that despair. As Penny quotes Che Guevara, "Revolution out of anger has no value. It must come out of love." And that was the mistake that the media made. The media thought Crass was from anger, not love. Subsequently, the punk music scene would later make the same mistake because they believed the mistaken message that the media would send them. No, the Sex Pistols weren't the very first punk band, Crass was, but they were very different. As Penny points out, the Pistols were an aberration on the face of rock and roll. Crass was an aberration against the state. While the Pistols created arguments in the media, Crass created arguments in Parliament and British government intelligence services. The real great swindle, Penny says, is the Sex Pistols sapped the energy out of punk and commodified it, while Crass was a threat to commodification culture. Crass's story is one of being an enemy of the state. Penny describes Crass's fight against the war in the Falklands, one of the few anti-war voices at the time against the Falklands War. Crass even had a source on the islands who gave insider information that was being kept from the British public. And when Crass secretly released a recording they made of a dramatized conversation between Reagan and Thatcher, they were accused of being foreign agents. Now guess which country they were accused of being foreign agents from. Penny, Crass, and the Commune Dollhouse all argued there was an alternative to Thatcherism, Reaganism, and neoliberal globalization long before anyone else was. And here on This Is Hell, we could not have had these kinds of conversations with one of the very first punks without your support. Thanks again to all our supporters. New Patreon patrons will be getting This Is Hell advertising stickers in the mail real soon, so you can subvert public advertisements with a cartoon bubble that simply states the words, "This is hell." See how all our patrons are subverting public advertisements by checking us out on Instagram at This Is Hell Radio, as I am on my annual family vacation during this week's live 4-hour over-the-air broadcast and across the net live stream of This Is Hell. Alex, what are you playing during this Saturday's Best of This Is Hell? I remember I think it's going to be a selection of stuff from our newest volunteer who just recently left the room, Leo O'Connell.
Yeah, it's Leo's choice. I actually, right now, as of recording this, have absolutely no idea what he wants to play. He said he has the interviews picked out, so we will be recording that probably next week.
On next week's Patreon podcast of This Is Hell, we will share what we have of our interviews with CNN anchor Jake Tapper from back in 2000 and 2001. When Jake was writing for Salon.com on the Bush v. Gore debacle, we interviewed Jake twice and possibly more, but our archives are not as well kept as we hoped. Who knew that depending on cassette tapes for archiving shows wasn't the best possible solution? So tell your friends, sign up at patreon.com/thisishell and subscribe so they too can hear some likely now embarrassing interviews of Jake Tapper. At least for Jake, I'm pretty sure it's the kind of stuff that right-wing conspiracy theorists who only watch Fox News and consider everything else fake news will absolutely love about our talk with Jake. That's all for now from what will soon be our new studios because of your amazing help and support. And we're hoping our first live broadcast from here will be in mid-September, so be listening for that. Manufacturing Dissent since 1996, This Is Hell, and now our January 2001 interview with Penny Rimbaud of the first ever punk band, the anarchist punk band, Crass.
All right, everyone. Punk rock died when the first kid said, "Punk's not dead."
Hello, Penny. Good morning.
Hi, good morning. How are you?
Very good. How are you?
Pretty good.
Listen, Penny, I want to explain something right away here at the starting. I know that you're going to think that I'm some kind of gigantic American arse or whatever. But we try not to preach to the choir here, so I want to assume that none of our listeners have ever heard of Crass or Dial House, because that way we can introduce people to what your band was all about and what Dial House is all about. That seems pretty fair, doesn't it?
That sounds pretty fair to me, yep.
Excellent. So you started Dial House back in 1967, and it was the home of Crass, but Crass wasn't even Crass yet, so I don't want to get all complicated right off the bat here. But Crass is often considered the first punk band. So what was it like in the pre-punk days of Crass?
Well, basically, I moved here, as you say, in 1967, looking for a retreat from a world that was beginning to look not too good to me. My idea then was to set up a community. In Britain, certainly at that time, that was an unusual thing to want to do. I think in America already the sort of commune movement had begun in those days. We found this little cottage way in the middle of the countryside on the edge of a forest with a lot of land. And at that time, we simply visualized the possibility of growing our own food, keeping our own animals, and developing our own life. We thought we'd be able to get away with that one, as I think a lot of people dreamt in California and New Mexico and on the west of America. And so it went. I mean, out of that, various creative forces developed. I mean, I moved in here as a painter, and there was other artists, filmmakers, writers living here from the very start. And increasingly we felt we wanted to get out, and we did get out in the form of, at one time we had a sort of thing, perhaps a little like sort of Ken Kesey's sort of travelling circus. Ours was perhaps more organised in the sense we were a travelling circus. We went around to universities and sort of concert halls putting on big circus shows which were sort of promoting alternative lifestyles in a fairly sort of laissez-faire, take it or leave it way. Certainly very little political agenda in those days. That picture changed somewhat through a relationship I had with a guy called Wally Hope, who was a sort of late 60s hippie, if you like, who had this vision of squatting Stonehenge, which is one of the major historical monuments of Britain, lays in the centre of Britain. And he had the idea of putting on a free festival. There were no free festivals in this country at that time. That was in the very early 70s. And together we planned organised and put on the first major free festival in this country, which was held at Stonehenge amongst the stones, much to the irritation of government of the time. The next year we did the same, but without Wally Hope, because by then he'd been incarcerated by the state, accused of being schizophrenic, and as a result of that treatment, either died or was murdered by the state. I've spent most of my life since then trying to work out that riddle. And that was probably, selfishly perhaps, the most politicising thing that ever happened to me, that was a direct experience. I mean, I seem to appear to be saying I wasn't political up until this point. Of course, I was well read and aware of what was going on in the world outside, but I think personal experience is the thing that draws these things closer to the heart and to the soul. And certainly the fate of Wally under the hands of the state opened my eyes that we weren't going to achieve the dream we'd seen. We were fairly peace-loving. We were fairly easygoing in our criticism. You know, we'd got our commune. We were growing our own vegetables. We were creating our own art. We took it out to Stonehenge, and then suddenly we were confronted with the full force of the state. And out of that, I suppose, out of my anger, out of my despair, came Crass, which was the first dark product of Dial House, the commune.
You know, I find that really the generalizations, the stereotypes that people have about punk. You wouldn't think that punk would come out of a commune group, an agrarian group, a group that's trying to be self-sufficient. Were you surprised when the type of music that you were doing, all of a sudden there were these other bands that were doing that kind of music?
No, I wasn't surprised. What surprised me, being a sort of eternal optimist and also being perhaps an innocent, was that whereas I believe our voice came from passion. There was I think it was Che Guevara who said that, you know, revolution is out of anger has no value. It must come out of love. So I think we were sort of in fairly good company. And I think that our passion very often was construed or imitated as anger, and very often ill-considered anger. So in that sense, I wasn't shocked. I was disappointed that the lack of depth of so much of what appeared to follow us came out of ill-rooted anger rather than deep soul-felt passion. So that was the only difference I felt, and that's and that's a terrible generalisation, because of course there were some very fine, passionate voices that followed us. But that would how I would define the difference, if you like.
You know, and you got to remember that this is obviously coming from an American's perspective, because you know what we know of punk here in the United States. I mean, I have friends of mine, Kevin Harris, who's running the board for us this morning. He's a huge Crass fan. I have friends of mine who are gigantic Crass fans, but not as many people here, not as much of a proportion of people in the United States know of Crass as they do in England. And what people think of it when they think of punk is that, well, the first punk band was the Sex Pistols. They're considered by many to be the first punk band ever here in the States. Why do you think that their stunt on the Thames following the Queen around on a yacht singing God Save the Queen got so much more attention here in the States than your efforts did? And did it get more attention in England than your efforts did?
I think what happened was that essentially speaking, the Pistols were regarded from the very start as an aberration on the face of rock and roll. Crass was seen from the very start as an aberration on the face of the state, and there's a big difference there. You know, the only real argument that the Pistols ever created was an argument amongst the record companies within the music business. We created arguments within Parliament. We created arguments with MI5, you know, who are our CIA, and that was the difference. I mean, the reason why the Pistols had so much massive media coverage was because they were no danger. you don't actually give massive media coverage to someone who is a genuine danger. We'd already proven, if you like, we'd got a good track record with Stonehenge. That was a major cultural event, and the ramifications of that remain right through to this day. It had a huge social effect. So we already had a very good track record. And I think that when we came along, from the very start, people knew we were serious. From the very start, the dangers to the state, to the status quo that we represented, were not something to be trivialized by the media. From the very start, we were not a part of the commodity market. The Pistols were always a part of the market, which isn't to denigrate everything they did. I mean, they did some fine songs and had within the sort of theatre, within the pantomime, within sort of De Boer's spectacle, they had a value, but they never, ever stepped outside the spectacle. We never, ever stepped into the spectacle. We are not part of the spectacle, and we remain not part of the spectacle today.
Do you think that the greatest swindle then was that they kind of sapped the passion out of punk and more commodified it than anything else?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's increasingly the case now, whereas, generally speaking, I mean, say, for example, if state radio, BBC, was to put on a program, which they do every so often, about punk, punk ends where we begin, always. And, I mean, there is within the academic world in this country now, in Britain now, crass are beginning to get mentioned, but, within any sort of popular commodification culture, we still are not mentioned because we still remain too much of a threat, I believe, to standard ideas.
But because your music was so unique and genuine and wasn't part of the punk music that, the 1977 punk music, do you yourself consider your band punk, or do you think that's just the way that music people need to label it?
I never was interested in labels. I mean, I would perhaps pretentiously prefer to identify what we had to offer more with perhaps blues, or with, and I don't mean the white version of blues. I think that soul music, whatever you want to call it, I mean, it's irrelevant to me. I mean, our tradition certainly, simply through our age, runs way, way, way back before punk was invented by the media, in the same way as hippie was invented by the media, basically to contain and possibly diminish, what was a very powerful movement and remains a very powerful movement to this day, because punk, hippie, beatnik, call it what you will. I mean, the fact is that the voice of dissent will always exist, and it doesn't really matter what it's called. So I've never actually regarded it as important whether we're a punk band or anything else band. It's of no interest or consequence to me.
Why do you think Americans were so bad at punk?
Were they? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't think they were they? I mean, maybe they were. I mean, I don't think Allen Ginsberg was a bad punk.
Oh, that's a good point.
Don't think Ken Casey was a bad punk.
That's a good point.
I mean, where does it begin? Where does it end? I mean, I think we carried more of the sort of beat movement into punk, so I look to them and I think, geez, that's where so much of my inspiration came from. That sense of, if you like, sort of social courage was so inspired by people like Ginsberg. It certainly wasn't inspired by people like the Sex Pistols. So credit where credit's due, if you like. In terms of American punk bands, and I'm not that knowledgeable about them, but I think certainly the Kennedys did some pretty magnificent work.
So what do you? I hate to keep sticking with this word. Now I kind of want to get away from it because you've kind of opened my eyes to and my ears to thinking about it in a different way. That it's just a sense of rebellion. But as far as the punk movement was concerned, what do you think is the legacy of that punk movement, and what do you think of bands that say they're the result of punk, like Rage Against the Machine?
Wow. Well, I think you've asked two questions there. Firstly, I'm not really in the least bit concerned about what, whether people, claim a part of a legacy. To me, the legacy of the immediate legacies of punk are something like Seattle, or something like the road protest movement, or something like 1,001 people acting from a deep felt sense of political conviction throughout the world. Pockets of people we don't even know about. That's what interests me. I'm not actually very concerned about the pop business and whether people think they've got Elvis Presley as a legacy or Crass as a legacy. That's of no interest or consequence to me whatsoever. What is of consequence to me is whether they're rock and roll musicians or a Chilean peasant. Is that something within their soul has been inspired by one of the voices of dissent throughout time. I don't care whether it's our voice or Ginsberg's voice or anyone else's, Walt Whitman's voice. Who cares whose voice it is? What's important is that we keep the flame burning. That surely is the only importance. That the medium it comes out is of no consequence. That it's the message which is of absolute consequence. So, that sounds like a roundabout evasion of your question.
No, I don't think so at all. I think that's a very unique and independent way of looking at it. I think that's very enlightening. We're speaking with Penny Rimbaud. Penny is a former member of, I should say, former or current member of Crass. I guess former. You stopped in 1984. And your first album, Crass's first album, Feeding of the 5,000, was named for the fact that the minimum number of albums you could press were 5,000 back then. And it's finally about to go golden, which I'm sure you're real proud of. The first track of Feeding of 5,000 is an interesting little story on freedom of expression. Can you tell our listeners about that?
Yeah, well, it was a piece called Reality Asylum, which actually I had written to Crass coming into being. I'd written it in a sort of 2-week spell of huge amounts of alcohol and huge amounts of depression, and out of it came, a sort of punk treatise, if you like. So it was almost inevitable that when we got around to recording something, the band took about a year after I'd written that piece to sort of come into existence. And it didn't come into existence by us sitting around at home thinking, let's be a rock and roll band. It happened, people would turn up and we just did things, and that happened to be the thing we did. We didn't really imagine that at any time we would be a band of any sort whatsoever. Anyway, we did. It's a spoken word piece, and it's basically about the role of Christianity within the role that, Nietzsche said that God was dead, and I've got a bit of an argument with him there, but he isn't around to sort of put his point of view now. But I don't think he is. I think Nietzsche is dead, but God still lives, and we've got a lot of work to do yet. And that was what that piece was about. And at that time, our first album was going to be pressed in Ireland, and it wasn't the state that stood in. It was the people on the factory floor who said, we're not having anything to do with this. We really won't manufacture this thing. So they sent it back to us. So I decided, the best thing to do is just to have 2 or 3 minutes silence at the beginning, which is the space that track would have taken up. End of story, really. So we then eventually got around to finding a company that was prepared to press it as a single. So we put that out as a single, and then were immediately visited by the Scotland Yard, who are, the sort of major police headquarters in London. Vice Squad were sent in. And from then on, we were sort of facing prosecutions and bannings, etc., etc., etc.
What was their logic for coming after you? What was their point of view of it?
Well, it was criminal blasphemy. I don't think you have that in America, but in this country there's a law against criminal blasphemy, and so to question the role of Christ or the Lord God Almighty within British society remains a criminal offence. So actually they were trying to sort of hang a criminal blasphemy case against us.
But it sounds like they just misinterpreted what you were saying.
They utterly misinterpreted what I was saying, but then, that law is about misinterpretation. When law starts beginning to be about interpretation, then, we've really made a big advance. As we know, most law, particularly when used against sort of radical thought, has been about misinterpretation.
One of the first ways that Crass got the word out was through the power of graffiti.
Yeah.
here in Chicago right now, we're having this huge controversy up on Chicago's northwest side of my neighborhood. There's a guy going around, and on for sale signs, he is writing, he or she, I don't know if it's a guy, is writing no yuppies on all the for sale signs because of the gentrification that's happening to our neighborhood. And so through the power of graffiti, it's working, where with front page stories or people are talking about gentrification. So why did you pick graffiti, and what do you think is so powerful about it?
Well, I mean, basically speaking, there's an awful lot of space which the capitalist world exploits, much to and uglifies. I mean, I find billboard work highly offensive. I don't need to know, and I don't want to know. I don't want to buy the products that are advertised, and I don't want to sort of have to look at how they are advertised. And so, obviously, they were setting up the canvas and inviting us to, produce our response. So, I think it's very, very powerful. Like you're describing this person working in Chicago. It's a very, very powerful form of comment, and I mean it was an obvious one to exploit. I mean, even myself had been in Paris about a year before we decided to start our campaign in central London, and we'd seen stencil techniques which we hadn't seen before in this country. So we sort of thought, well, okay, that's a very quick, efficient way of doing graffiti work. So we then started off the campaign. There would be anything up to about 12 of us working over the weekends, every weekend up in central London. And we actually managed to keep the whole central metro line graffitied for about 2 years. And we would be up there regularly working because it's such a powerful way of getting through a message.
What happened when you went on John Peel? Everybody here, even in the States, well, not everybody, but most of the people listen to this radio station. It's an alternative radio station. They're familiar with what John Peel does. What happened when you guys went on John Peel?
Well, very little. I mean, it was sort of fairly early. It was when the BBC state radio still sort of thought that we were just another, rock and roll band. I mean, the first thing that happened was they tuned our guitars, which we were very angry about because I don't think we knew you were meant to do that. Apart from that, they sort of attempted to sort of make us sound tuneful, which we didn't understand. I mean, it was all a complete shambles, really. I mean, we never met John Peel because you don't. And then when John Peel turned up on the show to, present it, he sort of spoke as if, he knew us, and we'd never even spoken to him anyway. And it was just a part of the sort of whole spectacle. I mean, we weren't drawn into it. We thought it might be a valuable thing to do. I don't think it particularly was a valuable thing to do. After that, there was occasions where we attempted to get some sort of dialogue with John Peel, who, incidentally, I think actually has got some admiration or respect for what we do. But because of his role within state radio, has never been allowed to express it. He can't express it, basically, because to do so would be to threaten his position. Well, he could do, but if he were to do it, then he would be threatening his position. So really, there's not a great deal to say there. I mean, basically, he has to serve a master, and he wasn't about to risk his position by making known his support for us, although his support for us did come through on other channels.
Do you know if any of the crash recordings on the John Peel sessions ever came out and were, are they in the public domain right now? Can people
No, I mean, interestingly, we're the only one. I think we're the only one because he started I think it was his own label where he was releasing his sessions, and I think we're amongst the only band. I think maybe we are the only band that he didn't release. I think that's partly because he knows that if he did he'd be in for a lot of stick, so I think he's just avoided that one.
Like you were saying before, Crass wasn't all about getting on the front page of NME, New Music Express. There were about, you ended up having discussions about you, as you were saying before, in the House of Commons, actually for speaking out against the war in the Falklands. And,
that's right.
Right when I started this radio show, our board operator at the time, I was telling him that there were many people, like a gentleman who's going to be on later in today's show, who were against the war against Iraq.
Yeah.
And he was unaware that that was going on because he was in junior high school at the time. And I
Right.
think that there are a lot of people out there that don't realize that there were people against what was going on in the Falklands. What was your stance on what was happening in the Falklands?
Well, it was very, very quick. Our response was quick in the sense that it kicked off. The moment it kicked off, we produced a single called "Sheep Farming in the Falklands," and which was a criticism of what was going on at that time. Nothing particularly was going on. The British fleet were heading towards the Falklands, and nothing had gone down. No one was dead yet. We actually went out on tour with this song, which was sort of fairly light-hearted. I mean, I don't think we could have believed what actually then eventually happened. But then it did happen, so we rewrote it. Included at the time an ex-skinhead who at one time had been very aggressive toward, written us some pretty sort of foul letters. We'd written back, and eventually sort of gotten friendly. Well, he was on board. So we were getting information sent up from the Falklands, through this guy about what was actually happening there. So we were getting information before the press was, basically. And we were trying to get it out. I mean, we knew about the sinking of the Belfast. We knew about what happened with the Sheffield, and that whole thing about Prince Andrew being on the Invincible, etc., etc., etc. So there's a lot of, very important state-controlled information coming through to us, which we didn't quite know what to do with. So some of that was included in coded fashion on a flexi disc we did, which we actually got manufactured out in Europe and then smuggled back into this country, and then through the help of various distribution companies was slipped into albums and EPs by other bands. And then when the shit hit the fan, we actually said, well, it was a bootleg. We don't know where the fuck it came from. But within that flexi, there was all this sort of coded information about actually what was happening. Then we became more open. We recorded another single after the Belfast had gone down called "How Does It Feel to Be the Mother of 1,000 Dead?", which was a sort of direct attack on Thatcher and her decision to sink the Belfast. But at the time, there was no other voice. We felt very, very alone in all of that. We came up for prosecution under that, and then we started getting letters from, quite a lot of people in very high political positions, sort of actually giving us support and saying, well, we need voices like yours. I mean, my response was, well, why the fuck where was your voice? Leave it to a bunch of punks to make the criticism. But we did make the criticism, and at the time we felt very alone and very threatened, I happen to say as well. It was probably one of our hardest periods. I mean, that sounded very muddled. I'm sorry, it's sort of like trying to get a whole history of something together in a quick moment like that. But I hope that explains roughly something of what you asked.
No, it does. I think that it gives people the impression that you were against something that everybody was for. It's much like when we speak out here about how wanting to end the sanctions against Iraq, and
right.
People don't understand. They're like, well, obviously then you support Saddam Hussein, and that's
right.
just not the logic of it.
No, absolutely not.
And you also, this wasn't too hard to do, but you screwed with Reagan's head too, didn't you?
Yeah, I think that was, in terms of political pranks, which is basically, well, it wasn't just a political prank. I mean, it was the time where Thatcher was up for re-election, and we were looking for ways of moving in on her, and what we did was we produced a tape of a telephone conversation between Thatcher and Reagan. Into Thatcher's voice, we put all sorts of coded information, which at that time was, strictly secret information, which we'd got coming out from this guy in the Falklands about the sinking of the Sheffield, the sinking of the Belgrano, etc., etc. So on the one hand, Thatcher was out of her own voice, telling people what had actually happened, but people weren't able to know had happened in the Falklands. On the other hand, we put into Reagan's mouth a lot of information which was hypothetical but equally true, about Europe being used as the central theatre, in the event of a nuclear war, and how he would be prepared to nuke Central Europe in defence of American interests, etc., etc. A lot of that was hypothetical and theatre, but probably fairly accurate. That tape was then taken off to Europe and distributed amongst the newspapers and totally disappeared. Nothing was heard of it for about 6 months, and it actually surfaced in the Pentagon. And we were accused, well, we weren't accused, the KGB was accused of, dirty tactic. It was used by the Pentagon as a demonstration of the methods in which the KGB operate to undermine, the sort of Western truths. It then surfaced over here. Well, it actually surfaced at that point also as a result of the Pentagon. It is the Pentagon, isn't it? Yes. Yeah. Their statement sort of then appeared in all sorts of American newspapers, and then it appeared in the British newspapers, the sort of major, like serious newspapers in this country, and then we will never know how it came back to us. We had a phone call one day asking us about a certain tape, which of course we denied. Well, eventually we invited the guy. It was from the Observer in London, and he eventually came out, and we'll never know to this day how it was traced back to us. I mean, we were absolutely covert about the entire thing. Very few people knew about the production of the tape. It was mostly done here and in our studio in London, only with people who we knew we could trust. It will remain a mystery all my life. I'll never know how anyone saw through that. In the end, we admitted that we had done it and then sort of took the flak. But
the flak wasn't that bad. I mean, you didn't. What was? Did you have to pay any penalty for doing it?
No, not in that sense. I mean, I suppose the flak was sort of more deep within our, own psyche, in the sense that, increasingly we started off serious. We'd got a message, live your own life, get your head together, sort of look at your own destiny, develop your own will, etc., etc. That's where we came from. We didn't, by the time the Falklands had blown, by the time, what had now became known as the Thatchergate tapes became exposed, we were sort of becoming political experts. People were looking to us to say, well, this is right, this is wrong, to make opinions, particularly from a sort of anarchist standpoint. We were becoming leaders, if you like, in a arena where the very thing we'd said from the start is there are no leaders. And that's where the flak was, I suppose. Yeah, the flak was 1,001 newspaper articles, 1,001 interviews about what do you think about? For fuck's sake, we were still developing our own sort of picture, our own view of the world. Suddenly to be thrown into becoming sort of like political figures was just not what we could possibly have conceived of.
We're speaking with Penny Rimbaud, former member, current member, whatever you want to say, ongoing member of CRASS. Why did CRASS dissolve? Is that why CRASS dissolved? You were afraid of exactly what you were just speaking of happening?
We weren't afraid of that. I mean, it was a realization, and I mean, part of that realization is that if you're going to be in that field, then you have to have an agenda to match it. And for all the will in the world, and for all the seriousness that we brought to our work within CRASS, the one thing we lacked was a cohesive agenda. We didn't need an agenda when Steve and myself started the band in the late 70s. We were two guys in a little country cottage, basically having a laugh. We were serious, but at the same time it was fun.
Right.
8 years on, we were of interest to the KGB. We were of interest to CIA. We were of interest to MI5. We were talked about in the House of Commons. For fuck's sake, at the same time that the potatoes needed harvesting. The cats needed feeding, and one had forgotten how to do those things. And we didn't have... How do we pull it through? What have we got to offer? For the last 15 years, since that time, I've been looking at that. What have I got to offer? What is the agenda? I have to find the agenda. We were in a position, and there's no question about it, 15 years ago, where we could have made a very, very big bang indeed. But when the dust had settled, what would we have said? Where would we have gone? It wasn't enough, and I knew that. And it took us, that time, it took us to be put into that position to say, okay, so we've got the criticism, but where's the agenda? And really that was, if you like, that's why it collapsed, because in the end, we didn't have a clear agenda.
So it seems that you have the same problem that people are having with our show, This Is Hell, this little program here, radio program here, in that people are having trouble figuring out if we're right-wing reactionaries or lefty radicals. Maybe we should do exactly what you did, which was just start hanging anarchist tags on our show. So how would you define anarchy?
Whew. Well, I don't think I would. Can I?
All right, that's probably the best answer I've ever heard.
Yeah, I don't think it's not my place to. I mean, as I understand it, is not cut through the shit. That's not the right. I mean, the work has to be done in removing the conditioned self, removing until there's nothing left, until there's nothing there but that emptiness that we were born with, and then to regrow, but not to regrow with imposed ideas, not to simply to grow with one's own soul, with one's own spirit. I mean, I'm sorry if that sounds a bit mystical, but there is life and there is that which is not life, and I don't think the two are compatible. And to grow with life, a new person, to be reborn, if you like, and I'm certainly not coming any sort of religious crap here. I'm talking about something very practical. To not be in the way of yourself, then somewhere within that, a morality can grow, which isn't just a part of our history, a part of our tradition, a part of the person my parents wanted me to be. And that's maybe what I've been playing with for the last 15 years.
So not defining yourself by the material that you've brought in around you, not defining yourself by consumerism, but defining yourself just by who you are, bare essence, naked on the street.
Absolutely, yeah.
All right.
And that has no label, which is why I was, if you like, evasive about defining anarchy. I can't do that because it can only define itself.
I think Kevin Harris, our board operator, has a question for you. Kevin?
Hey, Penny. How are you doing?
Hi.
I just want to say, I mean, a lot of people here at this station in Chicago are big Crass fans, and Crass music gets played on the air here. Just want you to know that people in Chicago hear Crass on the air. And I read that the big sort of manifesto that comes along with Christ the album,
right?
And over winter. And what really impressed me was the level of the adherence to nonviolent principles that goes along with statements of anarchism in that booklet. And I don't know, because in America people think that anarchists are inherently violent.
Right.
And so maybe if you could talk about that and just let people know what is the real motivation behind anarchism and the nonviolence principles with that.
Wow, I mean, that's a huge question. And
well, that's what Kevin's all about, is big questions.
I just do it once a show, big question.
I believe that, the end line of that principle, I think the essential belief of anarchism, and now I'm sort of contradicting myself in giving an answer, but we're fundamentally nothing. We're born with nothing and we depart with nothing. And that's the starting point. There isn't one person on this earth who initially I won't give my trust and love to. Now, my love can be taken away possibly, but my trust can't. And my trust is that everyone is reachable, everyone is touchable. There is no enemy. The only enemy is the lack of love. I do believe, and this isn't practical, and I'm not putting it forward as a practical issue. You know, if some guy's coming up to you in the street and he's going to sort of gun you down, it's not going to be useful. So please understand, I'm not putting this forward as a practical principle. I'm putting it forward as the essential. You know, where the ramifications and the modifications, you know, have to grow from that. But essentially, as I said earlier, you know, like Che Guevara saying that revolution must have a source within love, you know, that anger is not enough and never will be. It's self-destructive. One has to enter into any situation with the desire to communicate, and that desire to communicate has to come from love. And if it comes from oneself, then it's already prejudiced. If I enter into a dialogue and I carry myself into that, I've already prejudged that. I have to go naked into any confrontation, any dialogue. I must enter naked, because if I don't enter naked, I'm already taking in my own condition, which is going to be set up against a condition in attack or in opposition to that me that I am presenting. So only when I'm naked can that genuine change occur. And that genuine change doesn't only occur within the opposition, it occurs also deep within oneself. That is the self that must grow. Not the idea I have of myself, but on the naked self which will feed and grow and transmit true love and, in Shea's term, true revolution. So that is the fundamental, and I think possibly, you know, without going on for the rest of my life, you know, explains the question I was asked. That is the basic fundamental, as I see it, of anarchism. And if you want to call it anything else, call it anything else, because I don't care what it's called. I believe, I mean, it has a great nihilistic tradition as well. It just doesn't matter what it's called, but as I understand it, that is the fundamental.
We're speaking with Penny Rimbaud of Crass and a tenant of Dial House. That's the next thing I want to get to here, Penny. What is Dial House? Describe the countryside it's in. Tell us what it's all about.
Okay, so Dial House, you know, to go back to the beginning of our dialogue.
Our circular dialogue.
Yeah, we found this little. Some people have described it as a plant pot turned upside down in the countryside, and that's what it looks like in a way. It's a funny little red brick house, 1 mile from anywhere except another funny little red brick house, which is right next door, which is the farmhouse to which the cottage belongs, or used to belong. It's set in about 800 acres of rolling Essex countryside. The Essex countryside is rather like a small version of Virginia. I travelled through Virginia about 20 years or 25 years back, and it reminded me very much of this part of Britain. It's very green, very rich landscape, rolling hills, big trees, and we're set at the bottom of a little hill. It was the house that became the commune, that became the home of Crass, and has been my home and the home to many hundreds of people over its 33 years of existence, you know, in its present state. It has the misfortune, if you like, of now being set in what is the most sought-after land in Britain. The southeast of England is, prices are rocketing, huge amount of development. It's becoming sort of yuppie incarnate. Silicon City is being built about 20 miles up from here, around about Cambridge. There's new airports, new motorways, new tunnels, new railways, etc., etc. And plang bang in the middle of this is a little anarchist dream, Dial House.
So just this past week, Peer Group, a London developer who now owns the house, or no, they put the house up for auction, correct?
Yeah.
And the house went for about $250,000 American money.
Mm-hmm.
Were you afraid that when they put it up for auction that some nefarious persons would buy it and do something with Dial House that you don't want, including possibly evicting you?
Well, of course, afraid isn't the word. You know, I was aware that that was a possibility. Ultimately, I don't think it's good to be afraid of losing bricks and mortars. I mean, it would have meant a very different way of life, and you know, I don't particularly want to have to countenance that at the moment. But I mean, yeah, I mean, about 10 years ago, British Telecommunications, who, you know, a massive national, they're our equivalent to your Bell, I think, Bell Company, the telephone people. Anyway, they're huge here. They bought the land of which the house is a part, and actually wanted to develop that 800 acres of land into a huge, wealthy estate. You know, they wanted to build 900 luxury homes on the land. Well, we and the local villagers staged a massive opposition to them. I mean, they're probably they are one of the wealthiest companies in this country. So from the start, most people in the village were saying we don't stand a chance, you know, against someone as big as that. Well, through our experiences with Crass, we knew we did stand a chance, and we not only proved it to ourselves, we proved it to, you know, the local village. So that was massively empowering, you know, for thousands of people who live down in the village, who are a mile away from Dial House. As a result of failing to get their plans through to build this huge complex, they sold on to this company called Peer Group, who are much smaller but actually much more vicious company, absolute Thatcherite, new economy type developers. They have spent the last 6 years trying to evict us. You know, we've been through the courts. We've been broke 100 times over through the amount it's cost to fight them off. That resulted, our success in fighting them off, you know, resulted them in abandoning any hope of ever actually getting us out of here, which is why they put up the place for auction about a month ago, and why on last Tuesday, the 23rd, the place finally came up for auction and was sold.
So do you know what the buyer is planning on doing with Dial House, and do you ever foresee the tenants of Dial House actually owning the house? Is that what your next goal is?
Well, here the good news now, we bought it.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
When did that happen?
We had someone who remained nameless came in on our behalf about 2 weeks before the auction. She actually used to live here many years ago, when probably we might have been called hippies. Well, she's now in property. She offered to help us in any way she could, so she became a separate person with interest. You know, so she acted basically as if she was a, you know, punter coming to look at the place, taking over the bidding, etc., etc. Well, she won the bid on Tuesday on our behalf. We're now simply got to go through the paperwork with her until it's actually in our possession. I mean, it actually ended up with us having to pay considerably more than we had hoped we might have to. We set up an appeal, as you probably know, about a month and a half ago. Not only have we been deeply moved by, you know, the unbelievable generosity of people throughout the world, but we've also been inspired doubly to sort of reconsider our own role and how and what we could do with the house if we were able to buy it. And so it became increasingly important to us that we should buy it. In the end, we actually spent out twice the amount that we had thought we might have to buy the house. Now, this we've managed on several people have offered some pretty incredibly generous loans to us for us to pull it off. But we realized that it isn't just a house, it's an institution. And it isn't just an institution, it's an expression of a living dream. And it isn't a living dream, it's a living reality. And when it came back to the living reality part of that circle, we realized the thing we've got to do is hold it, and we've got to hold it and then grow it. And that's precisely what we're now in the process of doing. Well, actually, at the moment, we're in the process of trying to recover from the sort of ludicrously exhausting business of pulling off what we've pulled off in the last week. But, you know, once we've settled down with that one, then stage 3,984 of the programs off again.
So in the past, your work, the work with Crass, the work with Dial House, has gone to benefit charities, causes of one sort or another.
Yeah.
And now Dial House is looking towards the future because now that you own it. And at your website, you mentioned that you are playing with the idea of calling the new operation at Dial House the Center for Alternative Globalization. What does that mean, and what do you think what is alternative globalization?
Well,
another big question for you.
Yeah, well, an alternative an alternative.
I was going to make it a multiple choice, but I just couldn't think of it.
Well, I firstly like the whole sort of contradictory quality of alternative globalization, because the one thing globalization says is there ain't no alternative.
Right.
Well, I just like them to know here and now there is, and we're not about to invent it, because I think Seattle showed it, and 1,000 other people, 1,000 million other individuals across the world are showing it. And if we can add weight to that voice, and that's precisely what we're about to start doing. I mean, we have never stopped doing it, but what's happened through this appeal, what's happened through our fate, in the last few years, has shown us, the value, the importance. I mean, basically speaking, we've just saved one of the most valuable plots of land in Britain, if you like. I mean, that sounds very grand, but believe you, if you look at the sort of values and costs around here, we've just ensured that our dream, and I'm not talking about ours, Crass, is our dream. I'm sharing that dream with you. I'm sharing it with all the people who are listening. I'm sharing it with everyone who's written and who hasn't written, right across. This is our land. That's a part of it. Let's call this, 1 acre of the alternative globalization program. And there's a heap many more acres out there, and we're going to start sort of letting people know they're there. And the ideas that emanate from those. I mean, if I look at the force of what emanated out of here in the Crass days, then I'm not being I hope I'm not being arrogant when I say you ain't seen nothing yet, because now we're secure like we've never been secure. We've always had this threat. We've always been fighting off landlords. We've always been fighting off greed. Well, we've just sort of said, okay, this is ours, and this is ours until we want to stop it, and we ain't going to stop it. And now we've got a centre, and we feel very strong about that. I mean, I'm too tired to feel that strong yet, but I know I'm going to grow to feel very strong about this. And it isn't because it's me that's feeling it's strong. It's because, we've had fucking hundreds, thousands of letters over the last few weeks saying, yes, that is a dream. Well, I'm saying it ain't no dream. It's a reality, and we're going to make it work.
And finally, you have this litigious sword of Damocles taken away from over your head. Finally,
that's right.
Free from it. Just a couple more questions for you. Penny Rimbaud of Dial House, Crass. You can check out their websites, but they're really long. So just go to thisishell.net, and there's a couple of links right there. How can folks here in the States, let's say somebody's listening on the web, or somebody's listening just driving down their car here in Chicago, how can they help support Dial House in their attempts at whatever your future is, either a Center for Alternative Globalization or just continued forums and meetings and workshops? How can people here support you?
Ooh, that's like every question you ask, I can ask 100. I can answer 100 different ways. I mean, I want people to help themselves. Firstly, if we can help people help themselves, then that's what we can do. Secondly, so I'd just like to say the most important thing to me is that people help themselves. They find their own life. What I'm saying is that we've been here for 33 years attempting to help people, if we can, to realize their own lives. So that's my immediate answer. I'm not about to start saying, sort of send us money, send us this, send us that. I mean, the website sort of talks about our appeal. And if people are interested in helping us in that way, then look to that. I mean, but that's a very different thing that's a different agenda to what we're talking about, I think, and I hope, at the moment. I mean, I'm sort of certainly not on this air show at the moment to sort of promote our own interests, although those interests are shared with everyone who wants to share them with us. I mean, what's more important to me is that if you ask that question, is how can people help, then I can only say, well, look to yourself. Do you understand what I mean? I hope I'm not appearing, evasive or arrogant.
Oh, no, not at all. I think that's very honest of you. That's very charitable of you. You're the first person on the show who hasn't said, make your check out too, blah, 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 All right, and this is the last question I have for you this morning, Penny. It's what we call the question from hell, and I'm kind of going, again, we're turning back onto our conversation earlier, and I want to talk to Penny Rimbaud, the music and culture critic, I guess. What do you think of the infestation of American hip-hop and rap culture in England today? And do you see that as like the next step? What do you think of that as here in the United States, people saying that is what rebellion is in music and art today? What do you think of that?
Well, I think it's a very different situation between here and America. Firstly, I have to say that. I mean, secondly, I have to say that I've never heard any hip-hop music, and I wouldn't expect to hear hip-hop music. I mean, I'd have to have some very special friends, which I have got, and I could call through on that if I wanted to really hear what's going on. But what's happening in real hip-hop music in Britain is a strictly black music. There's not too much access, and quite rightly so, I think. It's a very, very difficult arena. I don't think it's the next big thing, because it ain't about that, and I'm quite sure the hip-hop exponents in America would say the same. I mean, just as punk wasn't about commodification, so hip-hop isn't about commodification. And every time that the sort of white capitalist interests catch up with that particular arena in black music, it makes a very quick move in, a sidestep into another development, which is why dance, which it more comes under in this country, is constantly making its shifts. It's constantly becoming inaccessible, a bit like jazz did, and still does. The moment anyone catches up with jazz, it's already gone around the corner and it's, blowing another tune. So if that's the only answer I can give. I don't see it as being, it's certainly not something which can be commodified. If it is commodified, it ceases to be what it claims to be. It has a very, very significant role, as I understand it, within black culture here, which becomes purely imitative, purely commoditive, and actually totally valueless when it is filtered out into white commodity culture, mainstream British culture. Is that a good answer or a bad answer?
That's a fantastic answer. You've been I have really. I want you to know that I really appreciate you coming on the show this morning.
Well,
I know this sounds ridiculous, but I know that it's just been a great honor to have you on the show this morning. And we've had very few guests like you on the show in the past. And I think that right now there are a lot of people who are listening here in Chicago and around the world that are very motivated by what you are saying. Peaceful, nonviolent, anarchy, and putting love above everything else, and thinking of other people before yourself. I think those are just all incredible goals. And I just really appreciate you being on the show this morning, Penn.
Well, I've really appreciated being here, and thanks very much for what you've said.
All right, take care.
Yeah, and you.
Bye-bye.
God bless.